Well, howdy, how are you? I'm the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com, and I hope you're having a great day. We're going to think about the term science and first principles of reasoning. We might even say first principles of all human reasoning, because all the sciences presuppose good logic. And the first principles of logic really are the first principles of any science whatsoever. We're going to compare and contrast the more modern definition of science with the classical view, and I'm going to defend the classical view here. We'll think about the first principles of all human reasoning. Those include the principle of identity, principle of contradiction, principle of excluded middle, and principle of sufficient reason. And we'll cover some other topics as we go along. So first off, how should we think about the term science? Now, oftentimes the modern view seems to give the connotation that the only type of science is a physical science, or a so-called hard science like physics, chemistry, or biology. And that's it. But the problem here is that this is too narrow of a view. It leaves out way too much. And the classical view hasn't entirely disappeared. For example, we still talk about the so-called social sciences. For example, is not economics a social science? Is it not a science? Is not psychology a science? And so forth. So it's too narrow of a view. But also, it can give us an exaggerated view because some people think that physics, chemistry, and biology can answer all questions, and there's no need to know about any other thing. But that's certainly false. To give a simple example, what about ethics? You're not going to learn what is right or wrong in a normative sense, in a moral sense, by just studying physics, chemistry, or biology. We need more. Moreover, the hard sciences like physics, chemistry, and biology presuppose mathematics. They presuppose logic. And logic and math are types of science. Now, with the classical view, the term science had a far broader definition than the modern connotation. It was never limited to physics, chemistry, or biology. Instead, a science is over a specific subject matter that could be studied in an organized, systematic manner based on some first principles or assumptions to launch the search, which looks for underlying causes and/or principles through a specific method of discovery. And that's exactly why logic is a science. This also means grammar is a science and theology is a science. So there are three basic elements. So the first element is one, we have an organized body of thought over some specific subject. Two, it will contain first principles. Now, these first principles or assumptions help us launch the search. It helps us engage in science because all sciences presuppose some basic principles. For example, consider physics. What would be considered a first principle of physics? Well, we could say that one of them is that there's an external world outside of our mind, outside of our head, that's intelligible. If we didn't uphold that, if we didn't believe that, if that wasn't a first principle, we couldn't study physics, period. End of story. Indeed, we can only develop mathematical models about the world around us because we believe there is a world out there and that that world is somewhat understandable, that it is somewhat intelligible. So physics has some first principles. One of them is there's an external world outside of our mind and it is an intelligible world. So we have two elements so far. We have an organized body of knowledge or thought. And two, we have first principles. And three, we have a search for causes, laws, or patterns that are relevant to the subject at hand. Now here I should extend this a little bit because if we think about a science, traditionally it's been thought that it has a material object and a formal object. There's all these distinctions that are very important if we're going to think about things in an organized, systematic manner. Now, what is the material object of a science? Well, that's just the subject matter. What are we studying? So physics studies one thing, grammar studies something totally different. What is the subject that we're studying? The formal object is simply the point a view from which we study. So we take a certain point of view in our study. If we're looking, for example, at a painting, it wouldn't make sense to apply physics to study the painting, because the formal object here is just going to be, well, maybe the atoms that compose the painting. But it's not going to tell us anything about the intentions of the artist or anything like that. So we have a material object and a formal object. Okay, so the classical view, science has three elements: organized body of thought, first principles, and it's searching for causes or laws or patterns, something like that. But logic as a science is unique. It's a science that applies to all sciences. Indeed, we have to think logically about the sciences of physics, chemistry, grammar, theology, and so forth. But what are the first principles of human reasoning? But even before we even get into that, let's think about first principles in general. So if we think about first principles, we can think of them as being antecedent to the science, whatever that science happens to be. So for example, the belief that there's an external world and that the world is intelligible is antecedent to physics, or to the study of physics. So let's consider the principle of identity. And the principle of identity is just that a thing is what it is. Socrates is the man he is or was. Socrates is an individual. He's a distinguishable thing from other things. Or in other words, the principle of identity is about sameness. It's a reflexive law, as a thing is always equivalent to itself. Something has the attributes it has. Socrates is the man he is or was. 4 is equal to 4. X is equal to X. And if you think about it, some philosophical principles, like the principle of identity, is self-evident, because it cannot, strictly speaking, be proven by prior principles. For otherwise, those prior principles, or what justifies them, would actually be the first principles. Consider the principle of identity. We can illustrate it or give examples, but nothing more basic could prove it. And surely it seems that everything must presuppose this principle. For an argument to be coherent and stable must always abide by it. Every judgment, every proposition exemplifies the principle of identity. For example, Socrates is a man, presupposes the principle of identity. If that judgment didn't presuppose it, then it could be the case that Socrates is not a man. But Socrates is what he is. He is not what he is not. Next, let's consider the principle of excluded middle. There is no middle state between being or existence and non-being. That is, non-existence. Something exists or it does not exist. For example, God exists or does not exist. That's the principle of the excluded middle. It would make no sense whatsoever to say that God exists. Well, maybe a little bit. He either exists or does not, period. There's nothing between absolute existence and absolute non-existence. So thus we have the principle of excluded middle. It's also known as the law of bivalence. Either something is or it is not. It cannot be both. It's a choice between having and not having. That is, between being and non-being. So the issue is over having existence or not having existence. There is no middle ground between contradictory judgments. But this raises another important distinction, and that is between contradictory versus contrary judgments or propositions. So if we're thinking about contradictory judgments, we have X versus non-X. There's no middle ground. With contrary, we have opposite extremes. And here, a middle ground is possible. Consider, for example, microscopic. The contrary to microscopic is gigantic. Yet something not being gigantic obviously doesn't entail that it must be microscopic, because there's a middle ground, there's a spectrum. But with being versus non-being, there's no middle ground. Socrates either exists or he does not exist. God either exists or does not exist. These are not opposite extremes, these are contradictory judgments. Now, when it comes to this principle of excluded middle, you might raise the issue of change. But change is always found within the realm of being. Change is always of something. Becoming is always of something. Next, let's think about the principle of contradiction. It's impossible for something both to be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. X and non-X can't both be true. It's impossible. Two contradictory propositions, they completely negate each other. They cancel each other out, so there's no way that both can simultaneously be true. Aristotle went so far as to say that if we deny the principle of contradiction, we really abandon all possibility of thinking in a right, good manner. We couldn't think or talk coherently about anything whatsoever. There's a sense in which a contradiction speaks against itself. A contradiction leads to a falsehood. In other words, avoiding contradictions means avoiding falsehoods. Now, to be sure, there have been some logicians who have denied the principle of contradiction, not in a universal sense, but they have said that there can be exceptions to the rule. But the problem here, it seems to me, is that what is a genuine example of something being true and also a contradiction? I've never seen any convincing example of this. But be that as it may, the principle of contradiction seems obviously true. The principle of contradiction tells us that it is impossible that Socrates is both a man and a non-man. Both claims cannot be true. So here we have an overview, an introduction to identity, contradiction, and excluded middle, but there's also something called the principle of sufficient reason. There are different formulations of this principle, but basically we can say that everything has a reason for its being or its existence. That is, everything has an adequate explanation for why it exists or why it is the way it is, either by its own very nature or by another thing through an external, extrinsic cause. Think about physics once again. It seems to presuppose the principle of sufficient reason. The scientist indeed looks for explanations. That's why he presupposes the principle of sufficient reason. And incidentally, at an ultimate level, if we take the principle of sufficient reason seriously, it seems to lead to the necessity of something that exists by its own nature absolutely. Now, the principle of causality, in fact, we can say is a derivative from the principle of sufficient reason. So a cause, or the principle of causality, is really a subset, we might say, of the principle of sufficient reason. Now, a cause either is going to explain the existence of something, or a cause is going to explain the mode of something's existence or the way it's been changed or altered. So that deals with the principle of sufficient reason. Now, I am the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com, and I hope this video has been helpful to you and interesting. There's a lot to say here, and there's a lot to learn. There's a lot for me to learn. I'm sure there's a lot for you to learn as well on this topic. In any case, I appreciate you watching this video. Please consider checking out my website at amateurlogician.com. You can subscribe to my newsletter there. Good luck and be well.